What is Epoxy Sculpt? How do I use it? And why do I think it's the best for the Nerf hobby? Hello friends, hello YouTube, how are you guys doing? Rainbow here with another Nerf tutorial-ish video. A couple of weeks ago in my German modding series, I posted a video on how to work with a Apoxie Sculpt, and it was in German. And I've gotten several requests if I could do English subtitles for this video. The thing is, I would have to manually sit down and type all the subtitles, and I hate typing. And then you need to place them where they need to go and all that kind of thing, which is why I thought I'd try to make a voiceover video for that video. So this is essentially what this video is going to be. I will be talking about Apoxie Sculpt, and I will be kind of looking at my video right here. I'm going to zoom myself to the upper corner of this video so you can see the original video. If you're German, by the way, I'll link the original video in the description so you can go and look at that if you want. Or you can also keep watching this one because they're great. But basically, this is me trying to not having to do the entire tutorial again. And yeah, just trying to set up for the first time. Please let me know in the comments what you think about this, if it helps, if you like it, if you don't like it, if, you know, yeah, whatever you think. I'm not going to do the entire 20 minutes. I'm going to skip back and forth just a little bit, and it's going to be fine and fun and all that. Before we dive into the details of how to use it, what is Apoxie Sculpt? Basically, just a quick thing. In the Nerf hobby, when we talk about epoxying something or using epoxy, there is two different things that could mean. It could be epoxy glue, and it could be epoxy putty. Well, at least in my opinion, that's the two things. The glue is one thing. It's two components. You mix them together, and you have set working time, and then it cures out, and it becomes rock solid, and you can, bind plastics together and all sorts of things. And epoxy putty essentially is a putty that works the same way. So you get two components, an A and a B, or a 1 and a 2, and you mix them in whatever mixer they have to, be put together. And then you have you start a chemical reaction within the putty itself, and you have a set amount of working time, and then it'll cure and it'll become rock solid essentially. And the putty is great for integration work, for body work, for shaping, for putting, creating new lines and all that kind of thing, and also for putting a little bit more weight onto your blaster and all that stuff. So I prefer using Apoxie Sculpt. Apoxie Sculpt now, it's just a brand of epoxy putty. So it's just a brand of many different things. So there's many others, and essentially they all work sort of the same. There's going to be differences in the chemical mixtures. I'm not going to dive into details of that one, but there's also going to be differences in the working time and the curing time and all that sort of jazz. But for me, Apoxie Sculpt is just the one that works best. It has the longest working time for me. So you get up to 2 to 3 hours, they say. In all honesty, I've never worked with one piece of epoxy for longer than an hour and a half. But it's fantastic. And then it needs 24 hours to cure. And if you find yourself that, within that working time, it kind of becomes a little bit more stiff, just add some water to it and it'll be nice and smooth and you can work it again. So the great thing about epoxy now is there's a variety of colors. So if you don't want to paint it, or if you whatever you want to do and you want to have the color showing through, there's a different variety of colors, which is great. But also it's such a long work time, and it's so nice to work with. And also it's not too sticky, but it's sticky enough. And then once it's hardened out, once it's fully cured, it becomes almost rock solid, but still is really nice and easy to sand. So you can see on that hammer shot here that I'm holding up right now, it is the hammer shot has already been worked on, and it's just been smoothed and sanded down with sandpaper, and that's all it is. And yeah, once that's painted, you're not gonna see the three parts, the recon, the epoxy, and the hammer shot. It's just gonna be one, and that's it. Then fully integrated. So how do I work with Apoxie Sculpt? It's the same as every epoxy putty basically. They mix together in a certain mixture. Mostly it's 50-50, but it'll read so on the box. And then you take out part A and part B, and you roughly eyeball it to about the same. You make a little ball and roughly eyeball it to about the same, and then you start mixing it together. And You keep mixing it together. You keep just sort of pushing and and mixing it until you have one solid color. So mostly one part is a little bit lighter than the other, and so that is all just one blend of color. And then they say, you just leave it there for 1 or 2 minutes, and the chemical reaction will start, and then you have an hour and a half to 3 hours of work time. And yeah, in my opinion, the first hour is fantastic. If you extend it to more than an hour, just add in some water and you'll be good. Whenever I work with epoxy putty, I wear gloves. And it's just a thing that I like to do because, especially in the first 45 minutes or so, this stuff is really sticky. And it'll just stick to your hands, and it does the same thing with the gloves even, but it's just easier to take off the glove and your hand's still clean. But also just for the feel, and because I like to add water every now and then, just dab my hand in the water and then just add it. I don't want to have all that mixing stuff on my hands directly. I just wear gloves. I would recommend you do that, but it's completely up to you. One thing I can really, really recommend getting are these things. Essentially, this is like, little metal sort of tools. And I bought them in the 12 pack, and they were labeled wax working tools, I think. And the fantastic thing about this is, um, as long as the epoxy is still smooth, like within the first hour, hour and a half, you can have a really nice and easy time to work the epoxy with these tools. It's especially helpful for doing sharp corners and edges and stuff. So for instance, like I'm showing here with this Raven grip, there is this area in the stripe grip where you can't enter with a sanding paper, or we're having a really hard time entering this with a sanding paper if you want to have it really nice and flush. So what I do is I just work it with this tool. So I basically just take that tool, and then when the epoxy is still wet, just work it in there. And yeah, many corners and edges I do the exact same way because it's so easy with these tools. They're like $10 on Amazon or something like that. So I highly recommend you getting some of those. Another thing that I recommend that I'm using, it's two old, very blunt kitchen knives, and as you can see, I've labeled them A and B, and it's for taking the epoxy out of the container, because you shouldn't take one tool or your hand to go into one container and then go into the other, because you will start the chemical reaction in the container and you can essentially throw the epoxy away. So with this Raven, we're gonna do most of the side panels, and I can explain most of the techniques. So here we go. So as you can see here, I'm getting out the epoxy. I'm eyeballing the size of the two balls, and then just adding a little bit more, and then it's just squishing it together and just doing that. And here's a little trick. I just sort of rip this apart and then put it on top of each other, and I rip it again, put it on top of each other, and do so for a couple of times, because that does a lot of the mixing work, and I don't have to mix them for that long. But then it's like 2 minutes, solid, just squishing this about. So one thing you need to know about epoxy, it will stick to the hand, to your hands or to your gloves, as I said earlier. So be aware where you touch your blaster. I try to always just touch the blaster when I have to turn it around in the same spots, so I don't have to look over the entire blaster when I'm done to see if I have little pieces of epoxy that I need to get off. So with this bit, we're going to start in the back of the Raven, and you can see I've drilled a bunch of holes through the shell where I want to put the epoxy. The reason I drilled the holes all the way through is if you just put the epoxy on top, even if it's a little gap or something, it'll just sit on top, and it has a chance of just falling out and breaking and stuff like that. So with the hole drilled through, I'm going to put epoxy through the hole and on the inside, and I'm just going to, on the inside, just going to make a little round ball and just sort of press it flush, so it will be on both sides of the plastic, and that way it can't go anywhere once it's hardened up. So I'm essentially just modding this into the crevice of the Raven. Just be aware that you don't necessarily want to get too much of the epoxy into that screw hole, but if you do, use your wax working tool or whatever drill bit you have or something, and just get it back out. And also you could just use a drill, when it's hardened out, to clear out that hole again. The other thing is, I generally apply more epoxy than I need to, quite a lot actually. The reason I apply a lot more epoxy than I need to is, like, if you want to make a new flat surface, it's really hard to just sort of like make that flat surface as you go. But it's really easy to sand down the epoxy to a flat surface. So I'll apply a little bit more epoxy everywhere, and then I take my sanding tools, my sandpaper, or whatever I use to sand, and I'm gonna shave this down to a flat surface, and that way you can, guaranteed to get nice corners, flat surfaces, and all that, and it makes it just so much easier. So you end up using more epoxy than you need, and you run through the stuff quicker, but it makes the integrations so much nicer, the shell work so much nicer. So now you can see I'm flipping over the Raven to the inside, and you can see where the white stuff, that's the Smoothcast 65D, what like holds the integration in the first place. But you can see those little gaps, and I'm just going to push in some epoxy here to make sure that, the epoxy on the outside and the epoxy on the inside, they bind, and therefore it'll create that solid bond around the plastic, and it'll be right where it is. And yeah, that's what I do with most of like the spaces where I put epoxy in. You just got to be careful on the inside when when you think of, like, you need to think of where you screw those holes, because on the inside, if there's mechanical parts that need to move there, you can't have epoxy sit in there. But it's a trial and error thing, and you'll find your way. With the next part here, I'm actually I know that I'm gonna resand and reshape the blaster, because the way those two shells line up right there is not how I want it to look. I want to have it a straight line from the back to the front. So I'm going to add a lot more epoxy, and I'm starting to sort of make that new surface. But as I said, more epoxy, and going to sand down later. And then we're going to fast forward and do the rest of it. So one nice thing that you can see here, when you're done with the epoxy and you've applied it, you could, make your sanding life a lot easier by then just sort of dipping your finger into the water and just running it over the epoxy just a little bit, because it'll get really squishy and really liquidy, and you can just sort of push it around and pre-make the shapes that you want to have later, so that you don't have to sand that much, and you also get a better feel of where you need more epoxy, where you need less epoxy, and that kind of thing. You can do that all around the blaster. And when I started off, that's the way how I actually did my integrations with epoxy putty and epoxy sculpt. And I tried to make a perfect surface just with the finger and stuff. It takes forever, and it's never straight, and it's never a perfect surface. So now I'm, just adding more. I'm still doing this, as you can see, all over this blaster, because it makes your sanding life a lot easier. But still, it's still more epoxy than I need, and I will sand it down later. The more epoxy you have on your blaster, you got to be careful when you flip it over, because you have the epoxy on the one side, and if you lay it down on your workbench, it'll stick to your workbench, which is why in this case I'm holding the stripe up so it doesn't touch. But you can see here the little dots, and I'm taking my metal tool with the bent end and just going to push it down, and I'm just pushing down those little bits and bobs of epoxy on the inside, and in the spots where I know that there could be more epoxy, I'm actually adding some and then pushing it down like this, and it's just going to be like a little knob on the inside, and that's all it is, for the epoxy to have something to hold on to, and so you don't run the risk of it just sort of falling out when you drop the blaster or something like that. All right, now we're going to do the grip together, and you can see I'm adding a lot of epoxy, and you will see that I'm going to cover that entire corner of the Raven there, because the way I'm going to work it out, I want it to be like it's one part of the shell coming from the stripe Raven part into the Raven part behind the grip, which is why I add a lot. And you can see I'm using that tool, as I earlier said, to make a clear line, because I know right there will be really hard to get in with a sanding paper. Yes, you could do it with a Dremel technically, but you would need to use like a really thin Dremel bit. And when you use that, it's really hard not to Dremel too much on the one side. And creating a straight line with a Dremel bit, that is something that requires a lot of skill that I don't yet have. And also I work it this way, and it is that's a little bit easier. Now, because in the back here where the stripe and the Raven meets, I have a little bit of a gap, so I'm adding epoxy from the inside as well as from the outside, and making sure that on the inside I'm using as much room as I possibly can for the epoxy to hold on to. So now with this bit of epoxy in the grip here, like I'm not concerned about being on level and everything with the grip and things. Are just roughly, because I know I'm gonna sand this down, and it's also going to be one thing that we want to have sand with both shells together, and want to have sanded both shells together so you get the same angle on both sides of the grip. And now I'm just adding as I said, I'm just adding a lot more epoxy here to make this entire surface because I know I want to sand it that way. If you don't want to sand it that way, if you're not closing off the last bit of the raven there and you want to sand it differently, fine to do so, and then you don't have to put epoxy all the way up the top. The reason I'm doing this up there, that's just because I know in my head where the lines want to go with the integration. And now I'm using my little tool here to reopen the screw hole that I just, filled with epoxy just a little bit. And in all honesty, I'm not worried about the screw holes too much. I'm going to let the epoxy dry and fully cure. And then I'm going to take a Dremel and then come in and redo the screw hole, and it's going to be fine. All right, everybody. So this is how I work with my epoxy sculpt. I hope this was helpful to you guys. I hope you now understand how I work with that. Again, the reasons why I think this is better than other epoxy putties is the work time. While the longer work time, while still just having a 24-hour curing time, and also the workability of the hardened and cured out product in the end. I just love how this behaves when you sand it. It is fantastic. I've done another video on the German modding series about how I sand, which tools I'm using, but essentially it's a power sander like the triangular ones, a Dremel with a sanding bit, a couple of sanding papers, a couple of files for the small stuff and things, and that's it. And yeah, I just love how this behaves when you sand it, which is why I like it more than others. I also think it's more durable. That's it. So when you consider working with Epoxy Sculpt or any epoxy putty, really, I'd say yeah, go for Epoxy Sculpt. Yes, it is a little bit more expensive than others, but I still say it's worth the money you put in because it's so good to work with. If you want to work with that, I highly recommend getting those wax working tools or something similar. Before I had those tools, I was using an old kitchen knife for the same thing. But the tools are just so much handier, and yeah, they're fantastic. And other than that, I hope this was helpful. So yeah, this video project was an interesting one. It turned out to be more work than I thought it was going to be, but I hope it was helpful for you, so let me know in the comments. And other than that, I'd really appreciate it if you give a thumbs up to this video, if you'd leave a sub and a like and all this kind of thing. So I'm still trying to hit those 1,000 subscribers for the live feeds with the phone and stuff. And other than that, it would mean the world to me if you go check out my social media, my website, my Instagram, my Facebook, as well as the videos linked on screen now. If you have any questions, fire away. And if not, happy modding. I'll see you next time. Love and sunshine.